Matt Hughes was such a dominant champion in his heyday, but of course, he was also one of those fighters who hung around too long for his own good. And by the time he was taking on Josh Koscheck, a guy who he would have been a solid match for in his prime, we got to see his deterioration of his skill set in full effect. After losing his balance in a clinch exchange with the Ultimate Fighter veteran, Hughes ended up on bottom, eating hard hammer fists from Koscheck that were having a clear immediate effect. And once Hughes rolled onto his side, it was simple for Koscheck to control him, and eventually put him out cold with ground and pound shots. A nasty final image of this once great welterweight icon. Ending up on someone else's highlight reel is a real worst case scenario for fighters. But when it came to Randy Couture's final appearance in the MMA cage, he fell victim to one of the most iconic knockouts in the history of the sport. Lyoto Machida timed his 46-year-old opponent perfectly, out-feinting him in round one before nailing the five-time UFC champion with an insanely good crane kick. This was a shot pulled straight from the pages of the Karate Kid script, and to this day, we've not seen anything similar pulled off so well. Unfortunately, this was the knockout that brought the legendary career of Randy Couture to its end. Though Randy's legacy was already set in stone long before he fell to Machida, this was an undeniably ugly way to bow out. Look, we understand that Ronda Rousey remains a divisive figure within MMA circles, but to see this once fearsome fighter get totally exposed and embarrassed by Holly Holm was only made worse by the fact that she somehow looked even more lost in her final ever MMA bout. When Rousey returned to the cage to try and rebound by taking out Amanda Nunes, little did we know just how badly it was about to go for her. Of course, Nunes was way better than we all realized, greatest to ever do it in fact, but this might just be the single worst UFC title fight performance we've ever seen. And as far as closing the show on her career went, it doesn't really get too much worse than this. Rousey wasn't exactly beloved by the fans at this point in her career, but looking back on it now, you gotta feel some amount of sympathy for her. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. This one really stung. Michael Bisping had just lost his UFC middleweight title in shocking fashion to George St. Pierre, getting dropped on the feet by the Canadian before eating a boatload of damage prior to going out cold from a rear naked choke. But just a couple of weeks later, and Anderson Silva was forced to pull out of his clash with Kevin Gastelum. Bisping, being the warrior that he is, stepped up to the plate and saved the Fight Night main event in the process. However, Gastelum was on a real hot streak and proceeded to score a brutal knockout of Bisping in the opening round, sending him to retirement on a loss that could have and probably should have been avoided. There was something poetic about Anderson Silva finishing his UFC career with a fight against the guy who was supposed to be the heir to his throne at one point in time. Sure, Uriah Hall did not climb that high in the end, but during his initial rise, the comparison between these two middleweights was undeniable. To see this fight in each man's prime would have no doubt been a lot better, but after Silva ran onto a swift hook counter from Hall, it brought one of the greatest UFC careers to a pretty underwhelming halt. After a 40-year-old Uriah Faber shocked the world by KOing the highly regarded Ricky Simon in his return from retirement, the UFC, for some reason, thought that setting him up for a clash with Petr Yan was a good idea. Faber's a legend of the sport, and with great reason, but Yan was and is a fighting supercomputer, and though Uriah had some early success, it really did not take Yan long to start getting his way. And in one particularly violent moment, he broke from the clinch and landed a very crafty head kick, catching Faber right at the end of his reign. And with that, Yan moved one step closer to winning the belt, while Uriah finally stepped away from the sport for good. Alistair Overeem is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and a definite candidate for the finest career without a UFC title. But by the time he took on Alexander Volkov, it was clear that the game was passing him by. His odd fighting style was designed with an increasing emphasis on preserving his stamina, but his chin and physicality just weren't there anymore, leaving him as a sitting duck for Volkov's far more diverse striking. And in the end, when Overeem fell, it wasn't in a blaze of glory. No, it was clear that he was done. Sure, he managed to rebound with a return to kickboxing, but let's just say that he was clearly dabbling in some semi-legal substances to get back to that point. His MMA career finished under far more predictable circumstances. Once seen as the guy who simply could not get finished, man who would never quit on himself no matter what the odds were, by the time Frankie Edgar eventually got KO'd by Brian Ortega and moved down to 135 pounds, it was clear that the wheels were starting to fall off. That being said, it didn't make watching him get KO'd by Marlon Vera and Corey Sandhagen any easier. Once he was being set up for a clash clash with the relatively unknown Chris Gutierrez. You just knew that the UFC were trying to squeeze every last ounce of value out of his name. And sure enough, Edgar did not take long to fall in this one final appearance as a mixed martial artist. His toughness was just no longer there, at least in the physical sense of the word. A sad ending to a truly great career. You know a retirement is bad when Dana White himself is even begging you to hang up your gloves. For Chuck Liddell, he was once known for his unbreakable chin, his massive power, and his ability to use his wrestling and physicality to keep the fight exactly where he wanted. But the version of the Iceman who walked in there to take on Rich Franklin was very far removed from the prime 205-pounder who won the belt. And with his chin gone and the MMA world nervously watching, Liddell went down from a punch that he would have easily eaten during his best years. All in all, it was a sad showcase and another reminder of just how brutal this sport can be to its legends. Of course, Chuck would break his own retirement 8 years later, taking a fight with a still active Tito Ortiz in one of the ugliest nights in MMA history, but let's not even get into that. And finally, we come to the retirement of Cain Velasquez, a fighter who struggled for fitness more than any other elite athlete in MMA history, with the exception of Dominic Cruz. Cain's work rate during his best years was truly insane, but his body simply could not handle the strength of his mind. So Velasquez began to fall apart, missing a huge chunk of his prime. Then, for some bizarre reason, instead of giving him a tune-up fight, the UFC decided to feed a rusty Cain to Francis Ngannou, who managed to TKO him in a matter of seconds. And as Cain fell, he blew out his knee as he did so. This would be the last time this heavyweight legend made the walk, unfortunately.